Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States and the President of the French Republic.
Good afternoon. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome President Mitterrand to the White House at this early date in our administration. Our two nations share a friendship which dates back to the revolutionary birth of both countries, rooted in common values of equality, liberty, and democracy. These bonds of culture, of history, and of common purpose have made possible a remarkable amount of cooperation in recent days in meeting the challenges in Iraq and Somalia and Bosnia. Today, President Mitterrand and I discussed the global partnership that we must bring to the post-Cold War world, new uncertainties and new opportunities. Both our nations and both our continents are renewing institutions of security and economic growth for this era. I salute President Mitterrand and the French people for their leadership, their exemplary contribution to the United Nations peacekeeping operations around the globe is just one of many examples of the contributions they have and will continue to make. This morning we discussed Russia, Bosnia, and the progress toward European Union. Over lunch, we will discuss other issues, including the Uruguay round of trade talks. We have differences on some issues. Clearly, we need French leadership to resolve some outstanding differences, but also to make common cause in the areas in which we agree. Both our nations are great trading nations and have much to gain by resolving the differences between us and moving the world toward a growing global economy. I am very, very hopeful that the United States and France can be partners in updating our common interests and in leading the G7 toward coordinated policies of global economic growth, and especially toward action in dealing with Russia. President Mitterrand is going to Russia soon, and he will be there and back before I have an opportunity to meet with President Yeltsin in April in Canada, and I look forward to closely consulting with him about that again after his trip to Russia. We talked a little bit about the Vance-Owen peace process today, and you might want to ask President Mitterrand about his views on that. Let me say that I have been very pleased with the comments that he has made today and with the possibilities that we might have toward working together to secure a peace in Bosnia. There are many challenges facing the great democracies of the world today. We have to reaffirm our support for the difficult transformations to democracy now taking place in the former Soviet Union and in Central and Eastern Europe, to reaffirm our interest in closely cooperating to advance peace in the Middle East and elsewhere in the world, and to promote democracy and economic growth throughout the world. We made a very good beginning this morning, and I want to publicly thank the President, as I have privately, for the enormously helpful conversations we had this morning. He has been at this work longer than I have by several years. I learned a lot today. I appreciated his candor and the insights which he brought to our discussion. I look forward to continuing over lunch and to continuing along in a significant relationship between the United States and France. And I thank you, Mr. President, and the microphone is yours.
Je vous donne maintenant la parole.
Mesdames et messieurs, tout a été dit.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think everything that needed to be said has been said.
Du moins, tout a été dit de ce qui
At least everything
a
has been
occupé
said
notre
about
conversation
what we talked about
et de ce qui l'occupera
and about what we will be talking
pour le
about
temps qui reste.
during the time that remains for our meeting.
Donc, je n'ai rien à ajouter
So I haven't really anything to
en
add
attendant les questions que vous poserez.
while waiting for the questions that
Je ne veux
you may wish to ask.
cependant
On the other hand,
pas omettre
I would like
de
to
rappeler, comme l'a fait le président Clinton,
recall, just as President Clinton has just done,
que pour un
I'd
Français,
like to
c'est
recall
toujours
that for a
un
Frenchman,
événement.
it's always a very important moment.
Et un événement
It's a real
heureux
event, and it's a very happy
que
moment
de venir à Washington
to be coming to
pour
Washington
rencontrer le
in
président
order
des
to
États-Unis
meet
d'Amérique.
with the President of the United States of America.
Et c'est avec le
And
même
so
intérêt
it is with the same keen interest
qu'aujourd'hui j'arrive dans
that
cette ville
today
capitale
I'm here in this capital city
afin de rencontrer un président
in order to meet a president
dont la renommée
whose fame
a déjà fait plusieurs fois le tour de la
has
Terre,
already encompassed the world several times,
mais que je ne connaissais pas.
but whom I'd never met.
Nous avons pu
And
parler,
now
je crois, utilement
we have had useful
des
conversations.
sujets traités qui ont été
And the
indiqués
subjects
par
that
le
we've
président
talked about,
Clinton,
as mentioned by President Clinton,
ont pu marquer
these subjects have
une similitude de
well,
prise de
have
position
given us the opportunity of seeing that our positions were very similar.
qu'il est agréable de constater
And
tant
it is
les
present-
sujets sont difficiles.
To note, particularly as the subjects are very
Bosnie,
difficult
ancienne
subjects.
Yougoslavie,
Bosnia, former Yugoslavia,
Développement de cette révolution qui se produit
development of the
En Russie,
revolution that is taking place
dans
in Russia
l'ensemble des pays de l'ancienne Union
and in all the
soviétique.
countries of the former Soviet Union.
Tout ça est naturellement très important.
And all this is very
Le président
important.
Clinton s'est intéressé
President Clinton
au devenir de la communauté
shown a
européenne.
keen interest in the future of the European
Je lui ai dit mon
unity.
sentiment
And I gave him my
et mes propres
feelings
engagements.
and what I was committed to myself.
Nous avons encore à
We
discuter.
have still matters to talk about.
Il y a des oppositions de point de vue ou d'intérêt,
There are
comme il est
interests
normal.
which oppose us, which
Entre
is
nos
perfectly
pays.
natural between our
Mais
countries.
il y a une volonté,
That's in the nature of things, but there is a real
d'entente.
determination to reach agreement.
et c'est ce qui anime
And
l'ensemble de
that
nos conversations.
Is, I think, which is the leitmotiv of all our
Enfin, je me réjouis de
conversations.
l'hospitalité qui m'est
And I'm
offerte.
delighted of the hospitality extended to me.
Je
Delighted
l'apprécie,
with the hospitality
beaucoup.
extended to me. I appreciate this very warmly, very
Je
much.
remercie en même temps
And I wish to express my
les
warm
membres de la
thanks at the same
presse
time to the members of the press
d'avoir bien voulu
who've been good enough
être présents au rendez-vous.
to be present here
Maintenant,
today.
je suis à la disposition
Now
comme
I'm
vous-même
at your disposal, as you are doubtless yourself, Mr.
de la
President,
curiosité des journalistes.
at the disposal of the curiosity of
Ils
the
seront certainement
ladies and
très
gentlemen of the
discrets.
press. I'm sure they'll be very discreet, they won't ask much.
Did you discuss at all the specifics of a possible American contribution of ground troops in the enforcement phase of a peace agreement in Bosnia?
Only in the most general terms. I restated the position of the administration, which is now well known in the public, that we were opposed to the introduction of American ground forces to try to mandate an agreement or to in any way engage in the present conflict, but that if an agreement could be reached, that the United States would be interested in being part of a United Nations effort to secure the agreement. Yes, Helen.
You said that both of you have reached some sort of agreements or on new efforts in Bosnia. Can you tell us what they are? And also, I would like to ask President Mitterrand, how can European leaders stand the slaughter in view of the lead up to World War I and World War II, the similarities of the hatreds and abuses that have led now to these conflicts?
Shall I go first? The only agreement we made with regard to Bosnia was that it would be an error for France to increase its troops or for the United States to introduce troops to become embroiled in the conflict, but that we both should be prepared to make our contributions to enforcing an agreement to securing the agreement if the Vance Owen process could produce one.
Madame, nous n'acceptons pas plus que
Madam,
vous
no more than you do.
les
We just do not accept violence of any
qui
kind.
se produisent
The
notamment
violences
en
that are
Bosnie.
taking place, and in particular in Bosnia.
Le problème pour nous qui
The
avons la
problem
charge
for us, and we have
de définir,
the responsibility
politique
of
de nos
defining
pays,
the policies of our
c'est de
countries,
savoir quels
Our problem
moyens
is to
employer?
know how, by what
De
means,
quels moyens dispose-t-on
what means do we have, and
pour
what means
parvenir
should
au
we employ
résultat
in order to get the
souhaité
result
qui est
that
celui de la
we all
paix,
want, which is peace,
ou du moins de la cessation des
or
violences.
at least the end of violence.
À cet égard,
And
je
in
vous
that
rappelle que
respect, may I remind you
la France prend
that
part
France
aux
is
efforts des Nations
participating
Unies.
in the United Nations efforts.
Elle est le pays qui actuellement
France is
fournit
actually
le
the
plus
country that
d'hommes,
is at present supplying the
contribution
most numerous
militaire.
troops, military contribution.
Près
to
de
the
5 000
UN efforts. More than, well, almost 5,000 men.
parmi
right now.
lesquels nous comptons déjà 12
And
morts
we already have lost 12
et plus de 100
killed
blessés.
and more than 100 wounded.
Notre position est simple à
Our position
exprimer,
is very simple to
bien entendu
express,
difficile à mettre en
but
œuvre.
of course difficult to implement.
Nous approuvons le plan
We approve
Vance-Owen.
the Vance-Owen plan.
Nous souhaitons son succès.
We want it to be successful.
Nous en voyons les imperfections,
We see in what way it is not perfect,
mais cet instrument,
but this instrument,
nous n'en connaissons pas de meilleur.
well, we know of none better.
Donc, comme c'est le meilleur
And as it is the
des
best
plans possibles
of the possible plans,
aujourd'hui,
right now,
Nous
as of
soutenons.
today, we support
nous
the
souhaitons qu'il
Vance-Owen
aboutisse.
plan, and we want it to be
S'il aboutit, s'il
well,
obtient
the
donc
basis of an
l'accord
agreement. So if it does
des trois
succeed,
parties
if it
concernées,
reaches, if it gets the agreement of the three
pourrait
parties
presque dire
concerned,
quatre,
one might almost say
ou
four
cinq,
parties or five
c'est-à-dire
even.
des
In other
trois
words, to
pays
include
que
the
sont
three
la Croatie, la
countries,
Serbie,
which are Croatia, Serbia,
la Bosnie,
and Bosnia,
mais aussi
but there are also
des Serbes de Bosnie,
the Serbs
peut-être
in
des
Bosnia,
Croates de
and perhaps
Bosnie,
the Croats
etc.
in Bosnia, etc.
Si cet accord est donné,
So if the agreement is
on en
reached,
discute pour l'instant.
and for the
vous
moment
le
it is
savez.
under discussion, as you know.
Toute une série de discussions
A
ont
whole
lieu,
series of
vont
discussions
avoir
that are
lieu,
taking
j'aurai
place and
l'occasion
will
d'y
take
prendre
place,
part moi-même
and I'll have occasion to take
dans
part
les
in
jours
them
qui viennent,
myself in the next few days.
ont pour objet
And the
de
purpose
faire
of all these
accepter
discussions
le plan
is to get
Owen-Vance.
the Owen-Vance plan accepted, agreed.
S'il est accepté,
If
au
it
bénéfice
is
de discussions, le cas
Thanks
échéant,
to
de
discussions and
modifications, s'il
possibly
est accepté.
modifications, but if it ends up by being agreed,
nous pensons
accepted,
qu'il faudra aussitôt
then we think that immediately
mettre sur pied,
it will be necessary to set up,
sans que la transition dure trop,
without the transition taking too long,
et même si elle pouvait être
and
immédiate,
if it could be immediate, a
une
transition, it would be
présence
even better.
militaire
We think we must ensure
respect des
military
accords
presence in order to ensure the full
pour
respect
que
for the
les
agreements reached,
passions et les
so that
animosités
the
locales ne
passions
prennent
and
pas
local
tout aussitôt le
animosities should
dessus.
not immediately prevail.
À cet égard, la France est
And
prête
in that respect,
à
France is
participer
prepared
à cette
to
force de
participate
paix
in this
sous l'autorité des
force
Nations
of
Unies.
peace under the authority of the United Nations.
Est-ce que les Américains sont...
President, do you think it would, actually a question for both presidents, please. Do you think that it would be useful to have an emergency meeting of the G7 sometime before the July summit in order to deal at the political level with the question of Russian aid? And if not, how do you propose breaking what seems to be the gridlock between the Russian government and the international lending institutions?
Well, the short answer to your question, I suppose, is yes, I think it is entirely possible that such a meeting might be useful. Whether a meeting is possible or not depends in part on the response of the other members of the G7. The Japanese, as you know, have territorial disputes outstanding and also have put a lot into the upcoming meeting in July. Perhaps there is some other way that we can engage the G7 in trying to address the Russian situation. I guess the important point I'd like to make is I don't believe we can wait until July for the major countries of the world who care about what happens in Russia and who would like very much to keep political and economic reform on track there to move. And President Mitterrand is going to Moscow, and then we'll talk when he gets back. Then I'm going to Canada. And at the conclusion of that meeting, if not before, I will try to move to mobilize others to act in this regard, whether or not it is possible to have a formal G7 meeting.
Le président Clinton vous a semblé disposé à s'engager sur le terrain en cas d'accord Vance-Owen. C'est-à-dire, pour faire respecter un accord, si accord il y a, est-ce que les Américains sont prêts à aller un peu plus loin que des moyens aériens? La présidence
lui-même à ce sujet à l'instant.
Yes, well, he just expressed himself on this a moment ago. He said that he did not want
Une
to
campagne militaire
engage in a military campaign
dans le désaccord
on the basis
des
of a
parties
disagreement
intéressées,
among the
c'est
parties
la position de
concerned,
la France.
and that is exactly the same position of France, as
mais
France.
qu'il était
But
disposé à
the
examiner
President also indicated that he
une
was
présence
prepared to
américaine
examine the possibility of having
dans
an American
l'ensemble
presence
des dispositions qui seront
in
prises
the framework of all the
pour
steps that will be
l'application
taken
de
for the
l'accord.
implementation of an agreement once an agreement is reached,
si l'accord a lieu.
if the agreement is reached.
Sur un sommet spécial du G7 consacré à la Russie.
Could you specifically talk about Russia?
Tout à l'heure,
The President?
s'adresser au président Clinton, je suis
Well,
heureux que vous m'ayez posé la
I'm
question.
glad you asked me the question too,
Je suis
because it was already a
favorable.
question from President Clinton. I'm in favor of what you were
pense même
suggesting
nécessaire,
an earlier G7.
car il y a des
I
problèmes
think it's even necessary
particulièrement dans l'Europe
because
de
there
l'Est
are
et en
problems,
Russie,
specifically in Eastern Europe and in
qui
Russia,
présentent un caractère d'urgence,
that are urgent,
indépendamment d'autres problèmes.
quite apart from many other
Je connais
problems.
moi aussi
I
l'opposition
also
japonaise.
know of about the
Peut-être
Japanese
le
opposition to the
le
idea.
Japon méconnaît-il dans les
Perhaps
circonstances
Japan is not having
l'importance
sufficient
des événements
regard
qui se
in this
déroulent,
respect to the importance of
essentiellement en
events that are
Europe.
taking place mainly in Europe.
J'ai déjà donné mon
I've
accord à
already
M.
given
Delors.
my agreement to Mr. Delors anyway.
President, did you discuss with the French president at all the Middle East peace process? And are you optimistic for the next round of talks that Syria comes to an agreement with Israel?
We have not discussed the Middle East yet. We will over lunch. Yes, I am hopeful. Go ahead.
Regarding your health care reform, now that you're so deeply involved in trying to find more budget cuts, what is your expectation for when you would start seeing some savings from health reform? And should Americans expect that they will have to settle for reduced core benefits, unless they can pay more, of course, for some sort of reduced services in order to achieve these savings?
No, I don't necessarily accept that. Of course, we have 400 people working on this now and consulting widely with all the people involved in the healthcare issue. Let me answer your first question pointedly. I believe under all the scenarios I have seen that I think are possible, we would see immediate savings in the private sector if we were to adopt a comprehensive healthcare reform package. That is, private employers and employees would see the rate of their insurance premium increases drop rather dramatically, and there would be really significant savings immediately in the private sector. Because those savings in the public sector would have to be used to provide some insurance, at least to the unemployed uninsured, who are about 30% of the total population of uninsured, at least to them. It might take 4 years or so before we would start seeing significant taxpayer savings. But interestingly enough, that's about the time we need it. That is, if you look at all the scenarios, the deficit can be brought down under our plan for 4 years. And then if health care costs are not brought under control, it will start up again in the latter part of this decade. So we certainly believe that the health care plan would bring the deficit down virtually to zero over the next 8 to 10 years. Now, will people have to accept a lower quality of health care? I just dispute that entirely. We're already spending 30% more of our income than any country in the world. I don't think that.
I mean,
Yesterday, the United States imposed some tariffs, additional tariffs on some products of steel. The argument is that the subsidies are unfair, but the other side says that the subsidies are not unfair. What is the middle ground? What do you think that can be negotiated? And also, I would like to hear the response of President Mitterrand.
First of all, I want to make it very clear that the steel case was a case which was made on the basis of the facts and waiting for me when I took office as president and waiting for our trade ambassador. So the real question was whether we would act consistent with the work that had been done before we took office based on the evidence that had been amassed then. And we decided that we had to proceed with that to provide the continuity of the enforcement of our trade laws. I think the ultimate resolution of all these things is to continue to work for a more open trading system. I am strongly committed to a successful completion of the Uruguay round this year, and to take other measures which will open markets all around the world and reduce trade barriers. And I'm going to do everything I can to be instrumental in that regard. In order to get there, every nation has to have some mechanism to protect itself if there is uneven treatment. And we'll always have factual arguments about what is even and uneven, but I think the key is, are we moving toward a more open trading system or not? Yes? Go ahead, sir.
We stop wars as long as the United States permits the sale of arms around the world by CIA agents and by bringing in arms from China, and now faced with the proposition from Soviet Russia that we let them sell conventional arms around the world to aid their economy. How can we get wars to stop under those conditions?
Well, I think both of us should answer that question. The President Mitterrand will be the company misery loves on that question. I believe the United States has an obligation to try to stop the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and to slow the proliferations of weapons generally throughout the world. It is not a simple or an easy thing to do, and our ability to do it is limited by the sovereignty of other nations and by the policies they pursue. But I can assure you, just since I have been in office and on more than one occasion, I have done what I could within the means available to me to try to limit proliferation, and I will continue to do that. One of the reasons, since you brought up Russia, let me say again, one of the reasons I think it is so important for us to try to move aggressively to give the Russians the means to restore some economic growth and opportunity and preserve political liberty is that as other options close to them, they will be more and more and more forced to look upon their capacity to sell arms as the only way they can earn foreign currency, the only way they can keep the economy going, the only way they can keep a lot of their factories open. So I think the case you have made in the question is a powerful argument for the policies we are attempting to undertake with Russia. Mr. President?
Qui concerne les politiques que nous essayons de mener avec la Russie. Monsieur le Président?
Je permettrai de rappeler à
Well,
Madame
I might simply recall to the lady who spoke that it was in Paris
issu d'une conférence
at
internationale
the end of an
qui
international
réunissait le plus grand
conference
nombre de participants connus.
where there was the largest ever number of participants. It was in Paris then that there was the signature of the Convention on the Prohibition of Chemical and Biological Weapons.
D'autre part,
Furthermore,
la France a toujours approuvé
that France has always approved
les différents plans de réduction
the
des armes
various
nucléaires
plans for limiting
signés entre
nuclear
les
weaponry
États-Unis
signed
d'Amérique
between
et
the
l'Union
United States of
soviétique
America and the Soviet Union in the past,
la Russie plus
and
récemment,
more recently with Russia.
que la France a pris
And
l'initiative
France took the initiative
d'interrompre les
of
expériences
stopping
essais nucléaires
nuclear testing,
pour laisser le temps précisément à
precisely
chacun
in order to give everyone time
d'examiner la possibilité
to
d'en finir
reconsider
avec
the possibility of bringing them to a definitive
surarmement dans
end
ce domaine.
with the end of overarmaments
Donc,
in
vous
this area.
rencontrez là un terrain tout à fait favorable.
So I think that there is a very
Cela ne se
favorable
conçoit,
ground
la
here.
réduction des armements
The reduction of armaments, though, can only be
et
conceived
la cessation des ventes
with
que
the
si c'est
ending
le
of sales of
résultat
arguments. This can only
d'une
be
négociation
conceived in the
internationale.
framework of an international
Aucun pays
negotiation.
autrement ne
No
peut
country otherwise
se mettre en situation
could afford to place itself in a situation
de danger
of danger,
si les
in
autres
fact,
pays ne font pas le même
if the other
effort.
countries don't do likewise and make
Et
the same effort.
Nous sommes disposés
But we're
à
certainly
aller de l'avant
prepared
dans ce
to
domaine.
move ahead in this direction.
Et son administration au cours des derniers mois, interpeller l'Europe sur la sidérurgie, sur l'agriculture, sur les avions commerciaux. Alors, je sais que vous avez réservé cette partie de la discussion pour le déjeuner, mais quel est votre point de vue?
But what is your viewpoint?
Décidé
we decided
d'en parler tout à l'heure.
to talk about this a little later on.
Je peux difficilement
So it's difficult for me to
accélérer le mouvement, moi tout seul.
accelerate things all alone, just of my own accord.
Mais le président
I
Clinton
can't jump
en
the
sait
gun.
autant que
But
vous, sans doute,
President Clinton probably knows as much as
sur,
you do
l'état d'esprit et celui de la
about
France.
my frame of mind and the frame of mind
Que
of
je
France
résumerai
in this
d'un mot.
respect, which can be summed up in a
La
word.
négociation internationale,
International
le
negotiations.
GATT, c'est la négociation
GATT
commerciale
is a trade
pour
negotiation,
en finir avec les protectionnismes.
so as to eliminate protectionism
C'est
precisely.
une négociation
And
globale
it's an overall comprehensive
qui touche
negotiation,
à
global
pas tous les
negotiation,
secteurs, mais
which doesn't touch all
beaucoup de
sectors, but
secteurs.
many, many
Et
sectors,
donc pas seulement
and
secteur
therefore
agricole.
not only farming and agriculture.
Si l'on envisage
If
cette discussion
one,
sur le
therefore,
seul angle,
looks at the discussion solely
ça ne
from
peut
the
pas
point of
marcher.
view of agriculture, then it can't work.
si on envisage
If, however,
une
it
forme
is
de
looked at
négociation
in the
équilibrée
form of a balanced negotiation
dans les différents secteurs
covering the various sectors
intéressés,
that are involved,
industrie,
of
services,
industries, services,
propriété, aucune raison
intellectual
de ne pas
property, and so on,
aboutir.
then there's no reason not to be able to
Et
succeed.
dans ce cas-là, la France
And in that
souhaite
respect,
aboutir.
what
car je
France
partage
wants
le
is that there
sentiment du
should be
président
a
Clinton
success of this,
exprimé
because
tout à
I
l'heure.
share the view expressed by President Clinton a moment ago,
Mieux
which is that it
on
is,
aboutira,
well, better we will be able
mieux
to succeed
et
in
plus
this
vite nous
respect,
sortirons de la crise
then the
actuelle.
sooner will we get out of the present
Encore
recession,
faut-il
the present
ne
crisis,
pas
the present
isoler les
problems.
sujets
But at the same time, we mustn't isolate and
traiter
separate our
l'un
subjects
après l'autre,
and just to deal with them piecemeal. No, we
comme
mustn't do
cela
that,
se passe trop souvent
which
aujourd'hui.
is what happens only too often nowadays.
President, another domestic question. Several questions have been raised by your agreement to cut spending further here. First among them is why you've agreed to general budget cuts without specifics when you have for so long been demanding specifics of others who wanted to cut the budget further. Also, Senator Sasser said outside that while you have not agreed to necessarily $90 billion in further cuts, that is about as far, he suggested, that you feel they could go without harming the economy. Is that the case, that $90 billion is it and no more suggestions need to be made?
Well, there are two different questions there. First of all, in this budget resolution, there is an attempt to deal by both the Senate and the House budget committees, an honest attempt to deal with the so-called re-estimates of the Congressional Budget Office. That is to get even more deficit reduction. And I believe it will produce far more than we even estimate. They have to decide to get the budget resolution passed by category. But I assure you that we will be very specific before the process is over. It is true that I think that we have cut the deficit in a 4-year period about as much as we should with these new numbers. But that doesn't mean we don't need more specifics, because we have to define how we're going to cut. And since I also strongly believe we have to increase our investment in education and training and in new technologies and in the things which will make our economy grow, it means we need all the suggestions we can get about other places we can cut the budget, and we will need to do that until the budget is finally passed. So I strongly support that. The Vice President, as you know, is heading the performance review audit of the entire federal government, and the more specific suggestions we can come up with that everyone agrees with, the fewer controversial and potentially damaging cuts we'll have. And let me just make the economic argument. Our deficit reduction package, and that senator after senator said today, you know, that this is the most credible budget I've seen in 15 or 17 or however many years. It is producing the desired results: low interest rates, stock market back up and doing well. We have to deal with that against a backdrop of a Europe that's had slow growth, Japan with some serious economic policies and no political problems and no political consensus about what to do about it in Japan. So we want to do what our European and Japanese friends have been telling us for years we should do, get our deficit under control, but we want to do it at a moderate pace so that we don't throw the United States back into recession and further complicate the economic problems of Europe, which will be helped by a growing American economy. So I think we've struck the right balance. That was the point I was making to them. Yes?
President Clinton, concerning the Middle East, you said that your country intends to play the role of a full partner in the peace process. How do you intend to translate this, and what would you tell Israeli Prime Minister Rabin when you receive him next week, so that to resume the talks, especially concerning the Palestinian deportees?
Well, I think that what we mean by full partnership was evidenced by the fact that the Secretary of State's first trip abroad was to the Middle East, and that he made aggressive efforts there to try to get the talks back on track and to involve as many parties as possible. In terms of what I will tell Prime Minister Rabin when he comes back, I won't say anything I haven't said in public about the deportee issue or anything else. We are working together. I feel comfortable and confident that he very much wants the peace process back on track, and I will support that. Okay.
What specific provisions do you want in the agreement on civil aircraft? And are you prepared to abrogate last year's agreement?
No, absolutely not. I think to some extent my remarks in that regard have been misunderstood, and they may be my fault. I support last year's agreement. The point I was trying to make is this. The United States had a big lead in civilian aircraft. Arguably, it was contributed to by the massive investments we made in defense and the spin-off benefits. That was always the European argument for their own direct subsidies in the Airbus program, that we had indirectly done the same thing through defense. It cost a great deal of money to develop new aircraft, to break into new markets, and to go forward. The argument I was trying to make to the Boeing workers last week is, and I will restate it here, is that the adversity they have suffered in the market is through no fault of their own. That is, they have not failed by being unproductive or lazy or asking for too much, but that Europe was able to penetrate this market because of the Airbus policy. And the blame I placed was on our government for not responding, not Europe's for trying to get in. That was their, that was their right. It was legal under international law, and they did it. Now, we chose instead to try to convince them to stop doing as much as they were doing, which produced the agreement to which you just alluded. I strongly support that agreement. I do not want it abrogated. I want it enforced. My policy now on this, and I don't want to prejudge the work that the commission we're about to appoint. Congress is going to pass a bill in the next few days. We're going to appoint a commission on the future of our commercial airlines company and our airline manufacturers. I don't want to prejudge that, but my policy basically has 2 points. Number one, the agreement must be honored and strictly adhered to. And number two, the agreement leaves the United States as well as Europe the opportunity to significantly invest in the development of new technologies for new generations of aircraft, and we have to take that opportunity in order to be competitive. So, I appreciate your asking the question because it gives me the opportunity to clarify my position. Thank you very much.
Follow up nuclear testing, Mr. President. Mr. President, can you respond to the